It began with the sound of the kettle, not a shrill whistle, not the impatient cry of steam, but a low, musical hum, like a sigh released into the cold air. The woman who tended it moved slowly, her motions deliberate, as if time itself had long ago agreed to match her rhythm. Her name was May, and she lived in a cottage that sat on the edge of everything, beyond the forest, beyond the last hill, beyond where roads even pretended to lead. There were no maps that showed her home. Only the wind, the sea, and the stars seemed to know where she was. Outside, the world had grown quiet. The skies were dimmer now, the horizon softer, as if the universe had grown tired of noise. Yet within May's walls, there was warmth. There was light. There was the smell of chamomile and cedar and the faintest touch of honey in the air. Every evening, just before dusk slipped into full night, May prepared tea for two. One cup she poured for herself, and the other she placed across the table, untouched, waiting. The ritual never changed. She would lift her cup, breathe in the steam, and whisper, "The world still turns just a little slower now." Then she would look toward the empty chair and smile, as though expecting a reply. Beyond her windows, the world shimmered faintly. The ocean stretched endlessly below the cliffs, reflecting what little light the sky had left. The air carried the scent of salt and the soft crackle of waves touching stone. May had lived here for longer than she could remember. Some nights, she thought she had always been here, that she had been born from the mist itself, created simply to keep this small flame of peace alive. No one ever came this far anymore. The paths had long vanished under moss and quiet. Yet sometimes she thought she heard footsteps, faint and careful, approaching through the fog. And when she did, she would set an extra spoon on the table, just in case. On one such night, when the fog lay heavy over the cliffs and the stars burned low in the sky, she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the sea. It was the crunch of boots against gravel. Slow, hesitant, real. May didn't move at first. She only looked toward the door, where the shadow of a figure flickered softly behind the window pane. Then quietly, she said, "You can come in, traveler." The door opened. A young man stepped inside. His coat was damp from the fog, his hair windswept, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I thought," he began, voice trembling, "I thought no one lived this far out." "Most don't," May replied gently, "but someone must make the tea." He looked around, at the shelves filled with jars of herbs and old books, the walls lined with ticking clocks that all seemed to run at slightly different times, and the fire that glowed softly in the hearth. "What is this place?" he asked. May smiled faintly, pouring another cup. "You're at the end of the world," she said, "and it's tea time." The young man stared at her for a moment, then laughed softly, the sound surprised and tired all at once. "I didn't think the end of the world would smell like honey and lavender." "It rarely does," she said. "Sit, before your tea gets cold." He obeyed. The chair creaked under his weight, and for a long moment they said nothing. Only the soft wind outside spoke, brushing against the windows like a whisper too gentle to disturb them. May finally spoke. "People used to come here all the time, long ago. They said they could hear the ocean singing, said the air tasted of memory. But now, only wanderers like you make it this far." He looked at her, brow furrowed. "How long have you been here?" She stirred her tea, watching the tiny ripples fade into stillness. Long enough to stop asking that question. The young man nodded slowly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table. A crumpled photograph, its edges weathered and soft. It showed a small group of people standing before a distant lighthouse, smiling beneath a wide, pale sky. One of them was a woman who looked almost exactly like May. He swallowed. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about this place," he said. "She said there was a woman who made tea at the edge of the world, for the souls who couldn't find their way home." May's smile deepened, faint but knowing. "Ah," she said softly, "your grandmother had a good memory." He looked startled. "You knew her?" May didn't answer directly. She only took another sip of her tea and said, "Tell me her name." "Lydia." May closed her eyes briefly, as if tasting the sound of it. "Lydia liked mint tea," she said finally. and she always brought her own sugar cubes. The young man's breath caught in his chest. You really did know her. May smiled, but her gaze was far away now, turned inward toward some quiet shore only she could see. We shared many evenings here. She always asked what was beyond the edge. I told her it wasn't for me to say, only for her to dream. He sat in silence, feeling the warmth of the cup in his hands. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing a faint, silver horizon where the sea met the sky. Is this really the end? He asked finally. May looked at him, her eyes soft as candlelight. No, she said. It's the beginning that people mistake for an ending. The world doesn't end, child. It only slows enough for us to see it clearly, maybe for the first time. He looked down, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger. I came here because I didn't know where else to go. Everything back there. He gestured vaguely behind him. It's all falling apart. May nodded gently. The world always has. And yet, somehow, it keeps finding ways to begin again. Would you like more tea? He smiled faintly. Yes, please. She poured it for him, the steam rising like pale ribbons between them. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. The clocks ticked at their own pace. And in the spaces between those sounds, something like peace began to grow, slow, steady, real. As the hours passed, the man's eyes grew heavy. They didn't stop him when his head began to nod, when his breath evened out into sleep. She simply sat there, watching the fire, keeping the time for both of them. When dawn finally touched the horizon, the man stirred. The world outside was bathed in gentle gold, and the sea shimmered like glass. He looked around, startled. The room was empty now. Only one cup sat on the table, still warm. The clocks ticked quietly, all perfectly in sync. He rose, calling her name once softly, but only the wind replied. On the table, beside the teapot, was a folded note written in careful script. There will always be tea for those who find their way here. The world never truly ends. It only waits for you to listen. He took the note, folded it into his coat, and stepped outside. The fog had cleared completely, and the air smelled like new rain. He turned back toward the cottage once, but it was gone. Only the sea remained, whispering softly against the cliffs. He stood there for a long while listening. Then he smiled, as though finally understanding something he hadn't before. And far away, carried by the wind, came the faint sound of a kettle beginning to hum. Patient, eternal, waiting for the next traveler to find their way home. The traveler walked along the path until the sea was only a whisper behind him. The mist thinned with every step, curling around his boots like threads of fading memory. He didn't know where the path led, or even if it was real. All he knew was that the air smelled faintly of tea and wildflowers, and that something in his heart felt quieter than it had in years. By the time he reached the valley beyond the cliffs, the sun was just beginning to rise, soft gold spilling across a field of heather. Dew shimmered on the petals like 1,000 tiny stars, and for the first time in a long while, he felt as though the world itself was breathing again. He found a fallen log by the edge of a stream and sat down, unfolding May's note once more. The ink shimmered faintly, as if the words were still alive, still whispering to him even as the world changed around them. The world never truly ends. It only waits for you to listen. He turned the words over in his mind, trying to understand them. But some words, he realized, were not meant to be understood. They were meant to be felt. He closed his eyes. The sound of the stream filled his ears, gentle, patient, eternal. When he opened them again, something in the distance caught his eye. It was faint, but unmistakable, a wisp of smoke rising beyond the valley, curling upward like a quiet signal. He rose slowly, heart stirring with curiosity. The smoke meant fire, and fire meant someone else. Another soul, perhaps, who had wandered to the edge. The journey took hours, maybe more. Time, here, had a way of stretching softly, like taffy in the warmth of sunlight. He moved through fields and forgotten trails, over moss-covered stones and quiet pools where the sky reflected perfectly. By the time he reached the source, dusk had already begun to paint the horizon in lavender and blue. In there, nestled among the birch trees, stood a small, weathered cottage. Its chimney puffed faint smoke into the cooling air, and light flickered behind its windows, a warm, inviting glow. Something about it felt achingly familiar. He approached the door slowly, hesitant. It creaked open before he could knock. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and oak. A kettle simmered softly over the fire, and beside the hearth sat a single teacup, waiting. The traveler took a cautious step forward. "May," he whispered, but the room was empty. Only a note rested on the table. "For you. The tea is ready." His throat tightened as he moved to the chair and sat. The tea was still steaming, the scent familiar, honey, lavender, and something else he couldn't name. He sipped, and in that moment, it was as though the entire world held its breath. The fire dimmed, the air shimmered faintly, and he felt, not saw, but felt, the presence of someone across from him. "Thank you for keeping the kettle warm," said a soft voice. He looked up, heart pounding. May was there, or something like her. She looked the same, and yet not at all. Her hair glowed faintly, touched by starlight, her eyes deep and calm as still water. "I don't understand," he said. "You were gone." May smiled. Gone is a word for those who still measure time. Here, nothing truly ends, only changes shape. He swallowed. "Then what is this place?" "It's where endings come to rest," she said gently, "and where beginnings learn to wait. Every time the world grows too loud, too fast, someone must come here to listen again, to remember what stillness feels like." He nodded slowly, her words sinking into him like warmth. "And me?" he asked. "Why did I find you?" May looked toward the fire. "Because the world was ending for you. You lost your way, but you listened, and that is all it ever takes." The traveler lowered his gaze to his hands, to the cup that trembled slightly between them. "I feel different here, like I'm being unmade." She smiled faintly. "You're not being unmade. You're being remembered." For a long while, they sat in silence, the sound of the fire the only voice between them. When he finally looked up again, May's chair was empty. Only her cup remained, and beside it, another folded note. "When you are ready, the kettle will know. It always finds the next keeper." He sat there for a long time, the words echoing softly in his mind. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead, he stayed awake beside the fire, listening to the rhythms of the world, the sigh of the wind through the birches, the heartbeat of the waves far beyond the cliffs, the endless, tender ticking of unseen clocks. And when morning came, the kettle began to hum again, as if it had always known he would be there to hear it. He rose, took a deep breath, and poured 2 cups of tea, one for himself and one for whoever would come next. Years passed, or maybe minutes. The traveler, now older, gentler, tended the cottage as May once had. He learned the songs of the wind, the quiet pulse of the tides, the subtle language of silence. People did come from time to time, lost souls, wanderers, those who carried the weight of endings in their hearts. And for each of them, he made tea. He never asked how they found the cottage. He never asked why they came. He only poured, listened, and let the quiet do its work. Each visitor stayed until they were ready. Some stayed a night, some a lifetime, but all left lighter, softer, as though they had left their burdens with the sea. And always, when they were gone, he would find another note, written in the same graceful hand. "Keep listening. The world is still speaking." Seasons turned, and the world outside continued to fade, slower, gentler, as if wrapping itself in eternal twilight. But within the small cottage, the fire never went out. The kettle never grew cold. One night, as the traveler sat alone, he heard something new, a soft knock on the door. He opened it, expecting another wanderer. Instead, he found the horizon. The sea had risen to meet the threshold, silver under the starlight, perfectly still. The air shimmered faintly, and the scent of lavender and honey filled the space between worlds. He took his cup, stepped outside, and looked out over the endless calm. Somewhere far above, he thought he saw May, or the memory of her, smiling among the stars. He whispered softly, "The tea's ready." And as he lifted the cup to his lips, the world exhaled a long, peaceful sigh. and the wind carried his words across eternity. When morning came, the cottage was empty once more. But on the table, 2 cups sat side by side. Steam rose gently from both, and the kettle, ever patient, ever faithful, began to hum again. Because the world, no matter how many times it ends, always remembers how to begin again. The sea never truly slept, only softened its voice to a slow, tender murmur. As days stretched into what might have been weeks, the traveler began to lose track of time entirely. The rhythm of the waves, the steady hum of the kettle, the flicker of firelight on the walls. These became the only clocks he needed. Morning and night were only shades of quiet now, colors in an endless, gentle twilight that cradled him like a lullaby. He had stopped wondering how long he had been there. The world outside, with its noise and haste, its spinning wheels of minutes and years, felt like a faint dream. The cottage, with its soft lamplight and the ever-present scent of tea leaves drying by the window, felt like the only real place that had ever existed. Sometimes he would sit for hours, simply listening to the wind move through the birches, its song blending with the faint ticking of unseen clocks hidden in the walls. It was as though the house itself breathed, patient, content, alive. One evening, as the sky deepened into its violet hush, the traveler noticed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The figure was slender, wrapped in a shawl that shimmered faintly in the half-light. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then the traveler opened the door and said softly, "You've come a long way." The stranger nodded, her eyes tired but kind. "The world was too loud," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I followed the sound of the kettle." He smiled, stepping aside to let her in. "Then it was waiting for you." Inside, the fire warmed her chilled hands, and soon the scent of freshly steeped tea filled the room again. Honey and lavender, a trace of cedar smoke. The woman, her name was Alara, drank slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup as though trying to remember something. When she finally spoke again, it was in a quiet, broken tone. "I used to be a painter," she said. "I painted oceans I'd never seen, skies that never ended. But then, I forgot why I painted them. The world turned gray, and my colors vanished." The traveler watched her for a moment, then said softly, "Perhaps the colors didn't vanish. Perhaps they were waiting here for you." Alara's eyes lifted toward the window, where the moon shimmered faintly on the river beyond the trees. "Do you really think so?" "I don't think," he said with a faint smile. "I listen, and when I listen, I hear that nothing ever really leaves." She stayed for many days, or maybe only a few moments. It was impossible to say. She painted the walls of the cottage with soft, water-like shades, strokes that seemed to move when the firelight touched them. Each painting shimmered faintly, like memory trapped in color. When she left behind a small brush by the windowsill and a note that simply said, "For when the world forgets its colors again." The traveler placed the brush beside the kettle. Years, or dreams, drifted by. Sometimes the traveler woke to find a new teacup waiting on the table. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would hear laughter from outside, faint and joyful, as if the wind itself were remembering an old story. Visitors continued to come. A sailor who had lost his way at sea, guided by the glow of the cottage. A child who claimed to have followed the echo of her grandmother's lullaby. An old man who no longer feared sleep. Each one brought something of themselves, and each one left a trace behind. A seashell, a half-written letter, a forgotten tune hummed in the quiet. The cottage gathered these fragments like petals, never questioning where they came from, only keeping them safe. Through them all, the traveler learned the art of stillness, the understanding that peace was not the absence of sound, but the presence of deep listening. Sometimes, late at night, he would speak aloud, knowing the cottage and the sea would hear him. "May," he would whisper, "I think I understand now." The end was never something to fear. It was always the beginning, learning to be gentle. And in those moments, he could almost feel her near. Her voice woven in the whisper of steam rising from the kettle, her laughter folded into the waves far below. One night, as he sat by the fire, the kettle began to sing in a way it never had before. Not a hum, but a clear melodic note like the chime of a faraway bell. The traveler rose and stepped outside. The sea stretched endlessly under a sky of silver mist, and along the horizon, small lanterns floated one by one, golden lights drifting across the water, carried by invisible hands. He walked to the edge of the cliff, breath caught in his throat. Each lantern shimmered like a memory. Faces he had met, voices he had heard, stories that had found rest in the quiet of the cottage. The lights drifted toward the horizon, toward a faint glow that pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping world. For the first time in what felt like forever, he understood what May had meant. Time could stand still for those who truly listened. Not because it stopped, but because in that listening, one became part of something larger, something eternal. He closed his eyes, the night wrapping around him like silk. The sound of the sea deepened, then softened, until it was no longer a sound at all, but a feeling, the steady rhythm of existence itself. When he opened his eyes again, dawn was breaking. The world shimmered with quiet gold. The kettle whistled once more, and beside it sat 2 cups, already filled. He poured one carefully, his hand steady, then lifted his gaze toward the light spilling across the cliffs. "Good morning, May," he said softly. The air shimmered faintly, as though answering. He smiled, closed his eyes, and listened once more to the world, the sea, the memory of all who had come before. In that stillness, he found that nothing had truly ended. It was all still here, the tea, the fire, the laughter, the listening, and the endless, tender sound of the world dreaming itself into being once again. The years drifted by like mist over the sea, and though the traveler never aged in any way that could be measured, the world beyond the cliffs did. Seasons passed unseen, civilizations rose and fell, and the waves still murmured their endless lullaby against the stone. The cottage remained, weathered but unchanged, its windows glowing with gentle warmth even when storms rolled over the ocean. The kettle never cooled. The fire never died. It was as though the house itself existed outside of time, a small and constant heartbeat in an ever-shifting world. Far beyond the sea, people told stories about the cottage. They said it stood at the end of the world, where the sky met the water, where those who were weary could find peace. They said if you followed the cry of the wind long enough, you would hear the faint hum of a kettle, and if you were quiet, truly quiet, it would lead you there. Some said the man who lived there had once been a traveler. Others whispered that he was no longer a man at all, but a spirit of the sea, waiting for those who had lost their way. One evening, when the fog was thick and the moon hung low like a fading memory, a small boat appeared near the shore. It carried a woman wrapped in a faded coat, her hair streaked with silver and her eyes tired from sleepless nights. Her name was Clara, though she had not spoken it aloud in years. She had left behind a world that had forgotten how to be still. She had been a writer once, of stories, of love letters, of small fragments of beauty that people had stopped reading when the world grew too fast. When she reached the cliffs, the wind seemed to whisper her name. The cottage light flickered through the fog, golden and warm. Clara stood at the door for a long moment, listening. Then, with a trembling hand, she knocked. The door opened slowly, and a familiar voice greeted her. "You found it," the traveler said, smiling as though he had been expecting her. Clara blinked. "How did you know I was coming?" He shrugged gently, stepping aside. Everyone comes when they're ready. The kettle knew first. Inside, the air was soft and fragrant with the scent of honey and smoke. The fire crackled quietly, and a small table was already set for 2. Clara felt her shoulders ease for the first time in years. She sat, and he poured her tea, amber liquid swirling with faint light. "I used to write stories," she said after a while, staring into her cup. Stories that no one read. They said there wasn't time anymore for stories. Not when everything moved so fast. The traveler's eyes glimmered. "And yet here you are? The world may forget the value of stillness, but always finds its way back." She smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "What is this place?" "It's a listening place," he said, "for the ones who remember how to pause." That night, Clara stayed by the fire, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without dreams. In the morning, the traveler was gone. Only the kettle remained, gently steaming beside her. On the table was a small notebook with her name written across the cover. When she opened it, the pages were blank, except for one line written in a hand she did not recognize. Write what you hear when the world is quiet. Claire stayed for days, or maybe weeks. The sea spoke to her, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath words. She began to write again, not for others, but for herself. The stories came easily, carried by the calm around her. She wrote about forgotten dreams, about love that lingered like the scent of salt and tea, about finding stillness at the end of noise. Each evening she would light a candle by the window, and each morning a new page would appear beside her notebook, a story written in her own voice, though she had no memory of writing it. The traveler never returned, but sometimes she would feel a presence nearby, a shadow of kindness just beyond sight. Years later, when Clara was long gone, another traveler arrived, a young man burdened by grief. Then another, a sailor, then a teacher, then a child with tired eyes. They all found their way to the same door. The same kettle waited for them. The same warmth filled the air. The cottage had become more than a refuge. It was a memory that the world itself kept alive. The sea guarded it, the wind carried its name, and the stars watched over it each night. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the tea always sang its soft, steady tune. One night, centuries later perhaps, the cottage was discovered by a young woman named Elise. She was an astronomer, chasing the stars and losing herself in the endless dark of her telescope's lens. She came upon the cottage by accident, lost in fog, while searching for a clear view of the heavens. But when she saw its golden light flicker through the mist, something in her heart stirred. When she entered, the air smelled faintly of tea and thyme. The kettle began to hum again, as though recognizing her. Elise sat by the window, notebook in hand, and watched the stars glimmer faintly on the water. Then she noticed something reflected in the glass, just above her shoulder, a faint figure smiling gently. It was the traveler. He seemed older now, his form faint and glowing like moonlight. "You found it too," he said quietly. Elise turned, but he was already fading. "Wait," she whispered. "What is this place?" The air shimmered. His voice lingered like the last note of song. "This is where endings learn to rest." Elise stayed through the night. She wrote the story of the cottage, of the traveler, of the endless cups of tea that had soothed countless souls. And when dawn came, she realized that the stars had not vanished after all. They had simply gathered closer, drawn to the warmth of the cottage's light. In time, she left too, leaving behind her telescope and a note on the table. For those who forget how to look up. The kettle sang again. The waves whispered softly against the shore. The world kept moving, but the cottage remained, eternal, unchanging, quietly waiting for the next weary soul to listen. If you stood by the cliffs on certain nights, you could still see its light shining faintly through the fog. A promise that no matter how loud the world becomes, there is always a place where silence will hold you gently, where time will slow, where tea will warm your hands and remind you that peace has never left. And if you listen long enough, you might just hear it, the soft hum of the kettle, the voice of the traveler carried by the wind, whispering one simple truth to the stars. The world only ends when we forget how to rest. The mist hung low over the cliffs that evening, turning the world into a watercolor painting of gray and gold. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of salt and pine, and somewhere beneath the steady hush of the sea came the faintest whisper of a song. It was not the sound of any human voice, but something softer, like wind gliding through hollow glass, or breath over the lip of a teacup. The melody was timeless and impossibly gentle. It was the sound that guided people who were meant to find the cottage at the end of the world. No map marked its location. No traveler ever found it twice by the same path. The cottage was said to appear only when the heart had gone too long without rest, when the noise of the world had pressed so heavily upon someone's spirit that silence itself reached out to guide them home. On this night, the wind carried another traveler toward that glowing window, a man named Nathaniel Hart. He was a craftsman once, a maker of fine instruments, violins, pianos, flutes, each with its own voice, each a vessel of human emotion made solid. But as years passed and his world filled with deadlines, orders, and the constant hum of screens, he forgot the sound of his own heart. Music became numbers, strings became deadlines, and silence became unbearable. When his hands began to tremble from exhaustion, he left his city behind and walked north, following no map, only the call of something he couldn't name. He didn't know how many days had passed before the fog parted and the faint glow appeared ahead. He only knew that his heartbeat slowed when he saw it, that for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of stopping. The cottage door was open, just enough to let a thread of warm light spill out onto the stones. Inside, the fire crackled, and the kettle on the hearth began to sing the moment Nathaniel stepped inside. The air was alive with comfort, the scent of old wood and honey, the quiet weight of peace. "Welcome," came a voice from the corner. The traveler was sitting by the window, his eyes reflecting the firelight. He looked older than time, but softer than memory. "You've come far." Nathaniel hesitated, his throat dry. "I didn't know where I was going." The traveler nodded, pouring a cup of tea. "Then you arrived exactly where you were meant to." They sat together for a long time, without speaking. Nathaniel felt something inside him loosen with each sip, as though the noise that had been roaring in his mind for years was slowly fading into the distance. The walls of the cottage were lined with books and shelves filled with small, forgotten objects, seashells, feathers, faded photographs, and tiny clocks whose hands had long stopped moving. After a while, the traveler said, "Every clock here once belonged to someone who found their way to this place." They stopped keeping time the moment they arrived. Nathaniel ran his fingers over one of the clocks, feeling the cool brass. And when they left, the traveler smiled faintly. Some never do. Others carry the stillness with them, and time no longer frightens them the same way. Nathaniel stayed the night, sleeping near the fire. In his dreams, he could hear faint music, not from an instrument, but from the house itself. The walls hummed softly, like one remembering the rhythm of the sea. He dreamed of his old workshop, but this time there were no deadlines, no fear of imperfection. Only sound, warm, human alive. When he awoke, the traveler was gone. The kettle was still warm, and beside it sat a small wooden box with his name carved on the lid. Inside lay a single violin string and a note that read, "Play when the silence feels heavy. The world will listen back." Nathaniel returned to the world beyond the cliffs, though he carried no map. He found a small cottage by a river, not unlike the one he'd left behind, and built instruments again, not for money, but for peace. Each one had a softness to its tone that no one could explain. When people asked him where he learned to make them sound that way, he would only smile and say, "From the kettle that sings at the end of the world." Years passed, and others followed the same unseen path, drawn by exhaustion, sorrow, or the simple ache of being human. The cottage remained patient and unchanging, though the traveler himself became more a whisper than a man. It was said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear him in the wind, a calm, steady voice saying, "Sit, rest, you made it." One winter evening, when the snow fell like quiet feathers and the sea had turned to silver glass, a child wandered to the cottage. She was no more than 8, wearing a coat too large for her boots leaving soft imprints in the snow. She was not lost, not exactly, but she was looking for something she couldn't name. Her name was Lily. She had been born into a world that moved too fast for her small heart, a place where even dreams were scheduled and silence was a rare and precious thing. When she saw the golden light of the cottage, she smiled as if recognizing an old friend. She pushed open the door, and the kettle began to hum its gentle tune once again. "Hello," said the voice, though there was no one to be seen. "Hello," Lily whispered back, climbing into a chair by the fire. "I was cold." "I know," said the voice. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded, and a cup appeared before her, steaming softly. She sipped it and sighed, her eyes fluttering shut. "It's warm," she said. The voice smiled, though unseen. "That's the point." She spent the night by the fire, curled in a blanket that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. When she woke, morning light filled the room, and the world outside the window was still. The sea glittered like a mirror, and for a long time, Lily sat quietly, listening. When she finally left, she carried a small pebble in her pocket, smooth, white, and warm to the touch. She didn't know it, but the pebble would never cool, no matter how cold the world around her became. Years later, she would tell her children that there was a place beyond the edge of the map, where tired souls could drink tea and listen to time itself breathing. And though she never found the cottage again, she carried that warmth in her heart until her last day. The world would continue to turn. Generations would come and go. But the cottage, the tea at the end of the world, would always remain, its window glowing softly through fog and snow, waiting for the next weary traveler who needed to remember how to rest. And if you ever find yourself walking through fog and silence, with the sea whispering softly below, you might see that faint golden glow far ahead. Step closer. You'll find the door open, the fire warm, and the kettle always singing quietly just for you. The years slipped by like gentle tides. Lily grew, laughed, worked, and loved, and though she lived in a bustling city far from the cliffs, there were moments, quiet, fleeting ones, when she swore she could still smell the sea. Sometimes, when the world grew too loud, she would close her eyes, hold the smooth pebble between her palms, and remember the glow of that cottage by the water, the hum of the kettle, and the kindness of voice she could never quite place. Time, as it does, rippled onward. The seasons changed their colors, and life carried her through them all. She married a kind man named Thomas, who had eyes that smiled more than his lips ever did. Together, they raised two children, teaching them to pause, to breathe, and to listen. On summer evenings, she would sit by the window, the pebble resting on her knee, and tell them stories of a house at the edge of the world where the sea met the stars. They would laugh, imagining such a magical place, and she would smile softly, never telling them it was real. She didn't need to. Some truths were meant to stay folded gently between memory and dream. As decades passed, the world around her grew faster, brighter, noisier. Buildings reached higher, lights stayed on longer, and silence became harder to find. Yet, through it all, Lily carried that same stillness within her, the same warmth she'd felt by that fireside long ago. Then, one evening in her twilight years, she found herself awake long after midnight. The city outside her window slept beneath a faint drizzle of rain, and the steady ticking of an old clock filled her small apartment. But something stirred inside her, a whisper barely audible, brushing through her thoughts like a distant tide. It wasn't words, but a feeling, a gentle pull. Lily rose from bed, wrapped herself in a shawl, and looked out the window. In the reflection of the glass, behind her tired eyes and silver hair, she saw something strange. The faintest flicker of golden light, the kind that comes not from electricity but from something older, something alive. Her heart fluttered, and she smiled. "It's time," she whispered. The next morning, she set out. No one saw her leave, and no one could have guessed where she was going. She took no map, no luggage, only her shawl, her cane, and the little white pebble that had never cooled in her hand. The city faded behind her as she walked. The roads gave way to dirt paths, then to fields of tall grass that shimmered beneath the sun. The air grew cooler, the scent of salt stronger. And when evening came, a soft fog began to rise, carrying with it that same faint hum, the song of a kettle waiting for her return. She followed the sound until the cliffs came into view, the same cliffs from her childhood dream. Her legs trembled, her breath came shallow, but her smile only deepened. There, through the mist, glowed a familiar window, the golden light steady and welcoming. The door was open. Inside, the fire burned bright, the kettle sang, and the air smelled of pine and time itself. Everything was as it had been, unchanged by the passing of years. On the table beside the fire sat 2 cups. "Welcome back," said a voice, soft and kind. The same voice she remembered, the one that had no age and no name. Lily turned toward it, her eyes shining with tears. "I wasn't sure I'd find you again. Those who are meant to return," the voice said gently, "always do." She sat down by the fire, her body tired but her heart impossibly light. "I've had a long life," she whispered, "beautiful and messy, loud and quiet, but I always wondered if this place was real or if I dreamed it." "Both," said the voice. "Dreams in places like this, they are one and the same. You carry them within you until it's time to rest." She sipped the tea that had appeared before her, warm, floral, tasting faintly of memory. The flames danced softly, and the light bathed her face in gold. "Will I stay?" she asked. "If you wish," the voice said. "But remember, those who stay here are never lost. They simply become part of the quiet that guides others home." Lily looked toward the window. Outside, the fog had lifted and the sea glittered under a soft blanket of stars. She smiled. "I like that." She leaned back, her eyes closing, the sound of the sea and the fire melting into one another. Her breathing slowed, steady and peaceful, and then, quietly, she was gone. The kettle stopped its song for a moment, as if bowing its head, and then resumed with a new, gentler hum, a lullaby carried by the waves. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in the distance, another traveler, weary, lost, aching for rest, began to follow the sound. By the next dawn, the cottage was still once more, glowing faintly in the mist. But if you look closely, you might have noticed a new detail. On the shelf by the hearth, beside the old wooden clocks and seashells, there was now a small white pebble, smooth, luminous, and warm. The voice of the cottage, which was no longer quite alone, whispered softly through the rafters, "Welcome home." And so the world turned, and the sea sang on, and time folded into itself like pages of a well-loved book. The kettle would always hum, the fire would always glow, and the cottage at the end of the world would wait, forever patient, for those who had forgotten how to rest, ready to offer them one final cup of tea before sleep. The cottage by the sea stood quietly after Lily's last breath had joined the rhythm of the waves. The air was still, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the kettle, which now glowed faintly blue, as if remembering her presence. The sea outside shimmered with a gentler light than before, the moon lowering itself slowly toward the horizon, as though bowing in farewell. The chair where Lily had sat was empty, yet not empty at all. There was a warmth in the air that lingered, a kindness that brushed softly against the edges of the room. The house seemed to breathe again, slow and steady, like someone asleep but dreaming deeply. The pebble on the shelf gleamed brighter for a moment before dimming to a soft golden hue, like a tiny lantern guiding unseen travelers through fog. The voice, that eternal, gentle caretaker of the house, spoke to the quiet air. She found her way home. It murmured, not in sorrow, but in peace. Beyond the walls, the tide began to turn. The waves brushed the shore with a rhythm so delicate it could have been mistaken for breathing. The stars faded one by one as dawn tiptoed across the horizon, painting the sea with colors of milk and rose and ash. Far away across lands and lives, others stirred. A young man in the city awoke with a strange warmth in his chest, as though he'd been hugged in his sleep. He didn't know why, but he rose early and brewed himself a pot of tea, the scent reminding him of something he couldn't quite name, something that made him feel safe. A painter across the ocean paused mid-brushstroke when she saw a glimmer of light in the reflection of her window. It looked, for just a second, like the flicker of firelight on water. She smiled, set down her brush, and whispered, "I remember." And somewhere in a quiet town, where the river curved like an old smile. A little girl held a smooth white stone she'd found near her doorstep that morning. It was warm in her hand, even though the day was cool. She tucked it in her pocket and decided she would keep it forever. The cottage, unseen and untouched by time, continued to breathe. By nightfall, the fog returned, and so did the sound, that quiet, faraway hum that drifted into the dreams of those who needed it most. One evening, much later, the fog parted again, and through it came another traveler. He was older, bent at the shoulders, carrying a worn leather satchel that looked far too heavy for his frame. His eyes were tired, not from years but from grief. He followed the sound of the waves, unsure how long he had been walking. The air felt strange, not cold, not warm, simply timeless. The closer he came to the edge of the world, the lighter his heart began to feel. When the cottage came into view, glowing through the mist like a lantern in a dream, he paused and wiped a tear from his cheek. "Am I too late?" he whispered. The door opened on its own, and the same soft voice answered, "No one ever is." Inside, the fire danced, and the kettle began to sing again. Not the same tune as before, but close enough that the man felt something stir deep inside his heart. He sat down, the warmth of the chair seeping through his bones, and stared at the cup that had appeared before him. "Where am I?" he asked quietly. "You're at the edge of everything," said the voice, "and the beginning of peace." He bowed his head, tears falling freely. "I lost her. I never got to say goodbye." The air around him seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment, he thought he saw her, Lily, smiling at him through the firelight, her eyes bright and kind. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. "She's here," the voice said softly. "Not gone. Never gone." He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The scent of tea and the sea filled his lungs, and the ache in his heart began to ease. When he opened his eyes again, the room was empty, or perhaps full, of every memory he had ever loved. The man sipped his tea. It was sweet, with a faint taste of lemon and thyme. Outside, the wind carried whispers across the waves. Not words, but a promise, that no matter how far one wandered, there would always be a place waiting, quiet, patient, and eternal, where one could rest at last. As the years melted into mist, travelers continued to find their way there. Dreamers, wanderers, and souls who had forgotten the meaning of stillness. The cottage never aged, never changed. Its windows always glowed, its fire always burned, and the tea always tasted of comfort. Sometimes, the stars above seemed to gather closer, like curious listeners drawn to the hum of the kettle. The moonlight shimmered over the cliffs, and the waves whispered secrets only the wind could carry. Inside, the shelves grew crowded, with pebbles, with shells, with feathers and trinkets left behind by those who came and stayed. Each one hummed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of the world. The voice of the cottage, gentle as ever, never spoke of beginnings or endings anymore. It spoke only of rest, of quiet, of the simple joy of being. And if you were to find yourself wandering someday, tired restless, unable to sleep. You might feel a faint pull in your chest, a sound you can't quite name. Follow it. You may walk through fog and wind, through days that blend into nights, but eventually you'll see it. A flicker of gold on the horizon, a warm glow waiting at the end of the world. The door will open for you. The fire will greet you. The tea will be ready. And when you sit down, feeling the warmth spread through your hands, you might just hear a soft voice say, "Welcome home." Outside, the sea will breathe. The world will turn. And for one perfect moment, time will stand still, as if the universe itself has stopped to sip its tea and listen to the quiet.